Aloha everyone, it is Ajanette and I am here to do your Chapter 11 lecture. This is our final lecture for the class. For some of this, it should be review. We started discussing an APA module at the very beginning before we started our lab work and conducting studies and research and writing papers. And your papers are in fact one way of presenting research. So this will be review as you enter into your final paper and as you are wrapping up your scientific poster presentation as well. We present our research in a few different ways. We present it through a paper or a manuscript that is either, in our case, submitted to an instructor as a demonstration of your learning, and then we submit it as a manuscript for publication in scientific journals where we share out our research findings with our colleagues, or we present it in a scientific poster and we share out our findings with our colleagues in a conference, or we do a presentation where we actually present our findings in a workshop format within that conference. And so all of these adhere to APA guidelines and formatting requirements. Remember that APA, it's a genre of writing. APA is the American Psychological Association, and having one governing organization that kind of establishes the code of ethics, the writing guidelines, the stylistic guidelines, having one particular organization do that allows for consistency throughout the field. It sets a standard of expectation and a standard of ethics that we adhere to as researchers, as academics, and as peers, as professionals and practitioners in our field. So the publication manual for the APA is what really dictates all of those stylistic requirements, those writing guidelines that we have to adhere to. And those apply both to our written papers as well as our posters and presentations we might deliver and prepare for a research conference. So they all set guidelines for the way in which we communicate that scientific information among our fellow scholars and researchers. Okay, so we know that the anatomy of an APA paper and poster have a title page where we present the authors and the researchers, their respective organizations or affiliations. We also present the title of the research, which often explains what the topic of the research is, sometimes the methodology that we utilize, and then we acknowledge any kind of grants or other types of support and assistance we received. The abstract is like a little miniature version. It summarizes the research and it pulls a little bit from every other section of the scientific paper or poster. Our introduction, better known as a literature review, opens up and establishes the broader topic and its relevance and importance, and then proceeds to go through a literature review, reviewing existing research that's been done on the topic, what we already know, and building a case for our existing study. Then it closes with a description of the present research, what the variables are, what our hypotheses or expectations are for our research, as well as outlining the methodology by which we're going to test those variables in just a basic design structure. Then we get into the method and we go into detail and we talk about the detailed methodology we use. We describe our participants, which includes how they were recruited, incentives, inclusion and exclusion criteria that was used for sampling methods, and then how many respondents we had, who was excluded and why, what our final sample size was, and then we describe the demographics and reference any corresponding demographics table. Then we move into the materials subsection of the method, and that describes all of the materials used in the study with regard to the substance of the study itself. So we definitely want to focus our attention on any scales that we utilized to observe, operationalize, and measure any kind of variables. For instance, Rosenberg self-esteem scale, Beck's depression inventory, and we describe each of those materials in detail. Then we utilize a procedure subsection which describes what the participants experienced. Overall, the training and the code of ethics was adhered to, and then they provided informed consent, and then what were the steps that they were exposed to. Then we go on and we close our method with the design and statistical analysis section. Then we move on to the results and we present the scientific findings. So this is where all the statistical language comes in, and we adhere to an appropriate statistical presentation of that content, and we provide the statistical evidence to support our findings, as well as the statistical interpretation of those findings and any relevant descriptive statistics. Again, referencing tables that might correspond to our results. Then we move into our discussion, where as an independent paper, it actually opens up describing the study in general and the results, not in statistical language, but more common everyday language, grammar terms, so to speak, how you would explain the study to anybody else. And then you go on and you discuss whether the results were consistent with expectations. If they were not consistent with expectations, why? Why not? What differed between our study and the other studies that caused you to make your prediction? Was it our sample that differed? Was it our design and method that was different? Was it our materials or scales that we utilized? What was different about our study that caused us to find results that weren't consistent with expectations? So you get in and you analyze the nitty-gritty differences that may account for why our findings did not align with that of other research. If it does align, then you want to explain maybe some of the broader theoretical explanations for those findings. What is contributing to that dynamic or that outcome? Is there a particular theory? Is there other research that explains and connects why those variables might somehow be related or impact one another, consistent with our findings? And then you also want to talk about limitations of the study as they might exist, maybe a little bit earlier in that discussion, and then move into a discussion of, recommendations of other research that can be done to offset and account for those limitations. And then as you close that discussion, you want to talk about what recommendations might you have for practice based on what we learned. What can we do with this information to improve the psychological functioning of our target sample? And then, of course, as scholars, we always provide our references, our source citations, and we make sure that it's inclusive of every study that was used and cited throughout our paper and or poster presentation. And so whether it is a paper or a poster, all of these sections and the data within each of these sections is always included and represented, even in a scientific poster. And so when you're talking about AP style, you want to be very clear and succinct in expressing your ideas. This is particularly important in a scientific poster where your space is limited. So you don't regurgitate all the information from your entire introduction in the paper Instead, pull out the most expressive parts. Pull out main ideas and concepts. Review that content and say, can I express this in a more concise way? Can I make this brief, to the point, and as clear as possible? We want to make sure we're speaking in academic language, in a professional tone and manner. We can do this by maintaining third person, making our writing more formal in that we're avoiding contractions, avoiding slang words, and really keep it as a professional presentation, right? Additionally, we don't want to kind of beat around the bush. We don't want to, try to expand out how we're saying something and make it more complicated and lengthy. We want to preserve, or should I say conserve, the number of words that we're using. So, additionally, you will have to avoid flowery writing, right? It can't be, metaphors and imageries and suspense, or a lot of students try to incorporate questions, like to draw attention. And that might be a wonderful strategy for an English class or a public speech, right? But when you're talking about scientific writing, we want to minimize that approach. And we really want to be more factual, report like short, direct, concise, report the facts as they are, as they exist, right? And while we might include technical language, it's important to make sure we're defining that, and that technical language is appropriate and applicable for our particular design. Don't try to make yourself sound smarter or more scientific than is necessary. If technical language applies to your particular research study, wonderful, but define it and explain it and cite your appropriate sources. And then be sure that you're checking your bias. Make sure your writing adheres to the guidelines in the APA, so we are avoiding bias as much as possible. We're avoiding othering individuals unintentionally, and we're making sure that we're presenting our findings as objectively as possible. So a couple of guidelines that you can look at in terms of APA style, where we want to make sure that we're really adhering to a style where we're using paraphrasing as best as possible, and not quoting as much. I don't like quotes at all, and I don't allow them in the class because I want you to practice paraphrasing. Be careful you're not in a position to be too critical of other research, but when you do, you want to focus on the work and not on a person. Additionally, you are going to have several references. Your intro will be packed with them. Remember, we are giving credit for even the idea and inspiration that may have come from another source. So make sure that you are incorporating references and source citations throughout. If not, it's plagiarism, right? We're acknowledging that our ideas are coming from other research, other scholars, and we want to credit them appropriately. And then additionally, we want to make sure we're adhering to the appropriate order and sequence of our sections of that APA anatomy. That is the scientific structure by which all sciences really adhere, but particularly psychology and social sciences. And we do not write in absolute terms. So be careful about saying we proved this, right? Or it definitively, indicated this. No, it suggests the findings support, right? We leave, remember that margin for error, that alpha level, that probability that we are wrong. We as researchers always leave ourselves open for the possibility that they're wrong or that we're wrong, and that new information may provide new insight, new theories, new conclusions. So make sure you're not writing in absolute terms. Other things that we want to think about in terms of avoiding bias, we want to be careful that we're not othering people, offending people, intentionally or otherwise, and that we are maintaining that professional, objective tone throughout. So be careful about the language that you're using. Make sure you're talking about the people and other traits and characteristics about the people, but center that person. So we say a transgender individual, right? We do not say transgender as a noun, those types of person-centered approaches. We also want to be specific in our language rather than general, and don't leave things for interpretation. You don't want the reader to interpret things through their own bias, right? We want to be very specific and very succinct. And we don't want to objectify people. And then additionally, we want to humanize our participants. Historically, we describe them all as subjects. Typically now, we describe animals potentially as subjects, but we typically will use the term participants. In your literature review, they might reference them as subjects, but we really do want to use participants to really emphasize that informed consent. They are willing participants in the study, ensuring that we are adhering to our ethical guidelines. And then here are some more inclusive terms that you can utilize. So try to avoid the gender bias, the heteronormative biases, the cisgender biases, and try to make sure that we are really using terminology that helps to show appropriate respect for all individuals, and not particularly leaning toward one group as being the centered group, but rather a more inclusive approach that recognizes the value of all participants. And then some other things that are not they're more technical, right? So some might say they're not as important, but they're still important, right? And so I would say the style of the writing, in terms of the mechanics, the technical formatting things, it's certainly not as important as the content, but you still want to be mindful of adhering to appropriate grammatical and APA style guidelines. So this is focusing on the mechanics. We definitely want to be mindful of these rules. Use our APA manual regularly as we're writing and as we're developing our presentations. Make sure that you're looking visually at your document. Compare it to the samples in the APA manual. There's a sample title page. There's an entire paper, sample paper. There's sample tables, right? So visually, does it have the same general appearance? What are the nuanced differences? And make sure you're doing your very best to adhere to those stylistic guidelines. Here's some of the most common errors people make. For numbers 9 and below, they will use the number, but you technically should be actually just writing out the name for that number and only using the numerals for 10 and above. You want to make sure you're adding hyphens where appropriate. Use et al. When appropriate, with multiple authors. And then you want to make sure your headings are appropriately capitalized. So make sure, again, you're checking your manual for that. You want to be careful with the word since, because it says because, and that might be implying a more definitive relationship and not allowing us to have that possibility of error that we spoke of before. Tables and figures are not appropriately formatted, don't have the proper table, table number, table name, notes and descriptions as is appropriate. Sometimes commas are either used too much or not enough. I would say most often not enough. We want to make sure we are adhering to that Oxford comma, and when you have a list, make sure you put that comma before that and. We want to avoid abbreviations. Spell out your terms, spell out your contractions. Make sure that most people, back in the day, we used to do period, space, space. You'll still see me do that. It's optional to do period, space, space, or period, space now. You will see me do period, space, space. And then make sure you're using the and appropriately, right? So you're using the and when it's in those parentheses within the body of the paper of a source citation. Smith and Jones in parentheses at the end of a sentence, comma, 2025. That and symbol is used when it's embedded in the sentence and it says Smith and Jones 2025 found blah 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 blah. Then we spell out the word and. So pay attention to those little nuanced differences. And then here's some great resources for you to utilize. Of course, there's our APA website. OWL Purdue is a wonderful option for you as well. And then a couple others that you can see here as well. Look those over, use those, and then make sure you are checking formatting of your references. References from a journal article are formatted differently than a chapter, are formatted differently than you might see like a dissertation. So make sure you're using that APA manual regularly to look at how to properly format each individual reference based on the type of reference that you're using. And just some general information for references. You want to make sure that you're providing all of the appropriate information in that reference section. You want to make sure when you're talking about other ideas or phenomenon that researchers have discussed or discovered or presented or suggested, you're citing them appropriately. Any type of theories, hypotheses, methodologies that they've designed or used, factual information that you gained from their research, and then any statistics that you provide. All of this type of information should have a source citation. So if it's a fact, if it's not your opinion, analysis, original or independent thought, it should have a source citation. And then make sure you're referencing your APA manual as well. And then also note that you have reports and papers, such as when you turn in a paper as a student, right? And they outline primary research. You conducted the study, right? So when the authors are the direct researchers, they collected the data, they present their findings in a report, and they do a paper. And we make sure that we include each of the required sections in the anatomy of an APA study, that title page, that abstract, that intro, that method, that results, that discussion, and that reference page. And then if they do a presentation for the purposes of a conference or something of that nature, they will also include information from those sections as well. And so it's really important to note that we are a transparent community as scientists, as researchers. We share our knowledge and our findings with others, and we share the method by which we derived those findings, right? And so what we do is we publish our research. Now, you do have studies that are not studies. You do have publications that are not actually studies. They might review someone else's research. So you have review articles. Sometimes there's literature review. They tell you all the research that's been done on a particular topic, or they review a good body of the research that's been done on a particular topic. But they are not actually conducting an empirical study, and they're not presenting any new empirical findings. They're merely reviewing what we already know. Or you might have articles that are reviewing studies, and based upon the findings and the research that they have, they are presenting a particular theory or a model by which they are interpreting those relationships and connections. And they also might go through and incorporate some of the same sections and structure of a typical APA paper that's presenting empirical research, but they don't have necessarily a method section. So they don't have a method or results because they didn't collect data, and they aren't necessarily presenting empirical findings. So you're going to see a lot of, in these papers, they may still adhere to APA style, but they may not have all of those sections because they are not primary research studies. For the purposes of this class, you can use these as background research, but I always set a minimum of how many empirical studies must you include. Because as primary researchers, we need to be going directly to the source, and we need to be reviewing direct empirical studies published by the authors who were in fact the researchers presenting their own research. It's okay for you to supplement your research with some review articles or with some theoretical articles, but rely primarily on empirical research. Go directly to the source. So as I mentioned, people might present manuscripts, particularly in graduate school when you are doing a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. You often prepare a large manuscript that is sometimes published through your institution, or a conference presentation, which can either be a presentation as in slides, or it might be a poster presentation as well. So when you're talking about oral presentations and you're doing a talk, you're hosting one of the conference sessions, typically you have slides. They also correspond with the sections that we've talked about, and you're presenting to an audience in a more formal presentation style. Or another way is through posters, where you actually have all of that information printed. You have a large poster, and all these posters are in a room, and you get to walk around and review what other studies have been done. And so it's kind of like speed dating, but from a research standpoint, where you're going around, you get to see which posters catch your eye, draw you in, and then you can have one-on-one conversations with the researchers there at their poster. And so typically for a research conference, we would submit an abstract of our work, and then the organizers are going to review those abstracts and invite whomever they select for a presentation. So note that we do peer review. This is in fact a peer review process, right? We're doing oral presentations with our peers, with fellow researchers and scholars, and they get to interrogate our processes. They get to have questions with us, and they get to have a conversation. So at the end of a presentation, there's a Q&A, or in a poster session, they're having those one-on-one conversations with us. And so we have to be prepared to speak, to defend our research, to present our findings. We need to be able to summarize those findings. What were the main highlights? What was the basic design? What were the highlights from the literature review, the basic design, the purpose of our study, and the hypotheses, and then the design we used to test those hypotheses? What were our findings, and what does it all mean? So a little bit of information from each section is incorporated into that oral presentation, either in a workshop delivery, and or we need to have that information really committed to knowledge and memory so that we can discuss that information when we're doing a poster session as well. So The more technical presentation of the information might be in the poster, and then we can verbalize what's on that poster and answer questions that may arise as people are coming around and viewing our posters. So similar to a science fair from elementary school, we have poster sessions, and then your poster can be more colorful, can be more visual, and it can invite people into the research question in a way that's going to stimulate a nice scholarly dialogue. And so here's a couple of different designs that you might see. You have the ability to mix this up, right? So there's no set, restriction. You just want to make sure that each of the sections are represented on your poster. Stick to bullet points rather than paragraph format. Remember, it has to be visible from a distance, from far away. So you want to use bolder, larger print, larger fonts. You can add visuals. You can add imagery, related imagery to your topic, right? Sometimes it helps to actually provide materials, particularly if you had like a stimuli that they needed to see and assess as part of their study. You don't need to be all-inclusive of your references. Some people actually put a QR code now, and that links to references. But do include the references for at least the content and sources in the poster, and then you can link them to a more comprehensive reference section for all the references that may have contributed to your study. Here's an alternative format. Again, you can mix and match how you see fit. Some of that depends on the nature of your study, the data that you have, the graphs that you might have, and figures that you might have. For these, you can add color where you really don't in a paper in a formal manuscript. So some guidelines, it's really about the main ideas. What is the most salient information? You want to use those large fonts that you can see from a distance. Make sure that you have clear headings, clear separate and distinct sections. Think about those bullet points rather than a big long paragraph. Use those columns and help your information flow in a way where it's really easy to see and break apart. Again, incorporate those visuals where appropriate, and include like the visual stimuli or photographs if there was an apparatus that was utilized. And then you can have decorative stuff, but try to make sure that it's limited and it's related and applicable. But ultimately, you're looking to stimulate interest and generate a nice, robust conversation with the audience. And then here's a resource for you from Dartmouth College that gives you some poster instructions as well. And then if you want to see some other formats, there's some additional links, and you can go on and look at other undergraduate research studies and samples that have been done from various conferences that have been held. And so with that, I'm going to wish you the best in your poster and presentation of your content. I am excited to see all of your research and your presentations, and I look forward to celebrating the hard work that you all have done and all of the learning and skills you have developed over the course of this class. I wish you the best. Mahalo for your time, commitment, and dedication. Much love and aloha to all of you. Bye-bye.